Hello to those of you who are just joining us. We're going to let a couple more folks filter in, and then we will get started in just a moment. Okay. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us. My name is Maxine Hillman. I support the engagement and outreach team here at the Water Power Technologies office, and I am so happy to be here with you for the next in our Water Power Technologies office R&D deep dive webinar series. So for those of you who are kind of new to this, we brought about this series as a response to our semi-annual stakeholder webinars, where we realized that our program managers just barely had enough time to get into the overviews of what was happening and the updates of what was happening in their programs, let alone dive into the incredible work that's being done by our PIs and partners throughout the nation. So I am incredibly grateful to be joined today by Erin Levine and Taylor Curtis from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to tell us about updates to their RAPID toolkit. I would be remiss, however, if I did not take a moment to plug a couple of upcoming events. Next week, on Thursday, July 15th, from 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern, we will have that same semi-annual stakeholder webinar. So if you are looking for a more broad overview, please join us. We'll discuss our goals for the next fiscal year, as well as go over any updates that have occurred since our last semi-annual stakeholder webinar in March. At the end of the month, we will have our next R&D webinar on July 28th on where the CrossLab team from Primer will be joining us to talk about WPTO's centralized system for storing, curating, and disseminating data and information on marine renewable energy. And then finally, on August 11th, we will have an R&D deep dive showcase on our Seedlings program, which is a novel funding mechanism that allows WPTO to foster innovation and remove some of the stigma of failure. So real quick, some quick logistics. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to registrants. That'll likely happen in about 2 weeks to give us time to send the recording out for transcription. Attendees' microphones are muted and attendees are not visible on video. Questions will be answered throughout the presentation, though we will put a focus on questions being answered at the end. To ask questions, simply submit the questions into the chat box. Make sure that you select everyone so that we can all see it. And if you do have any technical issues, try calling into the webinar via the phone. So without any further ado, I give you Erin Levine and Taylor Curtis.
Great, thanks, Maxine. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of our agenda and how we're going to move forward. So we're going to begin by providing just a brief overview of the RAPID toolkit itself, our development history, the tools available within the toolkit itself. Many of you might already be familiar with those, and so we'll try to keep that brief. From there, we're going to briefly touch on some user metrics from the last year. We've found it helpful in the past for those who have been stakeholders and involved in this project, particularly since its inception. to see our growth and to see how the toolkit is being utilized by the hydropower and greater renewable energy communities. And then finally, we're going to walk through a substantive component of our presentation today. We're going to speak to both our process for how we go about updating the content within the Rapid Toolkit as statutes, regulations, and other policies change. And then we're going to walk through some of the updates that we've made over the last year, as well as a number of updates that we're currently tracking. And so my colleague Taylor Curtis will lead that discussion. I'm sure, as many of you are familiar with us being at the outset of a new administration, there are lots of rulemakings and executive orders and other things that we're tracking that might take a while to come to some sort of finality, but we're going to at least bring to your attention the type of issues that we're tracking and hopefully make you aware of some of these issues if you aren't already. So with that, we're going to go into the Rapid Toolkit presentation. To begin with, the Rapid Toolkit, while we're focused today on hydropower, we have developed the toolkit for geothermal, solar, and bulk transmission development. Currently, most of this is in a maintenance phase. However, our bulk transmission effort is expanding. We recently expanded to include bordering Canadian provinces for those situations where you would need potentially a presidential permit. Those have come into play with importing hydropower from Canada into the United States and the need for new transmission infrastructure. And now more recently, even, we are currently expanding into the U.S. territories, particularly Puerto Rico, where we're assisting with the disaster recovery efforts there and utilizing the Rapid Toolkit as a how-to guidebook to guide the new poles and wires, the transmission and distribution infrastructure that will need to be developed as part of the rebuilding of the electric grid in Puerto Rico. So a quick history of our Hydropower Rapid project timeline. This project began in 2015. We initially roadmapped federal regulations, which play a central role, as many of you know, in hydropower licensing, the roles of FERC, the other federal resource agencies and land management agencies. And we began with a couple pilot states, looking to California and Vermont. We eventually then expanded this to include a number of individual states, 6, I believe, in total, where we've included kind of every type of development and looking at from small hydropower to non-powered dam development, pump storage, to more traditional, run-of-river or impoundment dam reservoirs. We also have developed this for the 2 U.S. ACE regions, the Army Corps of Engineer regions, that have the greatest potential for developing non-powered dams. And so that included an additional 15 states really geared along the Mississippi and the Ohio River Valley areas to address some of that low-hanging fruit, so to speak, in terms of the more likely near-term development opportunities for hydropower. Throughout this process, we've continued to hold dialogue with interested agencies and stakeholders. We've held a number of these webinars, both targeted to individual entities, whether it's trade associations, organizations of state agencies or federal agencies. But we've also, the last couple of years, held these more broad webinars, capturing the entire stakeholder audience to really gain that feedback that we can utilize to develop a better tool as we move forward. As we moved into this last 3-year phase, we developed a series of best practice papers and case studies pertaining to various topics within hydropower, including settlement agreements, the type of licensing process being utilized, reclamation projects with Lisa Power privileges, and a few other topics. We'll briefly touch on those and point you to where you can find these best practice papers and case studies. And then we've been maintaining and curating the content on the Rapid Toolkit itself. So moving into the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, continuing to track those type of rulemaking changes, changes in legislation. We've added processes over the last few years, including the expedited process for closed loop pump storage projects and non-powered dams. that FERC initiated through a rulemaking required by Congress, along with other changes relevant to the federal landscape and where we have identified in the state landscape. And something that I ask of all of our users is certainly to make us aware of any changes at the state level that you may be aware of, because we generally are more equipped to track federal development on a kind of day-by-day basis than we are at the 50 state level. And even when we're dealing with 20-something states here, it can be quite challenging. So when you come to the homepage of the Hydropower Rapid Toolkit, you'll see a number of our tools that we have included here. We have our regulations and permitting database. This is where you can find the information that includes what type of permits are required for your type of development, what the thresholds of those are, the approval criteria, links to agency websites, the statutes, the regulations, guidance documents, applications. All of that is going to be available in the regulation and permitting database. We also have a reference library that we've created that includes all of our material that's cited and referenced within the regulations and permitting database to allow someone to go, if they didn't remember exactly where they might have found a guidebook or something within those pages, they can go to the reference library and use that search tool to identify those there. And then finally, as I mentioned, this best practice library that really speaks to some case studies, strategies, and some more detailed information on specific processes within the hydropower licensing and federal authorization process. We also usually have something going on in this little window here, if you can see my cursor. We currently have last year's FY20 Hydropower Rapid webinar. This provided a deep dive into a basin-wide assessment case study best practice paper we had completed. We'll be replacing this with today's webinar. Periodically, we also include, if we're going to be in-person events when those take place, or other virtual gatherings, which has become the norm over the last year or so. So it's something to be on the lookout for if you do visit the website, to see if we're going to be participating in various events, such as HydroVision International, which has been an event we've participated in the past, National Hydropower Association events, things along those lines. So again, we have these 3 tools and 3 pathways that you can enter within the Rapid Toolkit, and I'm going to briefly walk through each of those for our stakeholders. So to begin, when you go into the regulations and permitting section, you're going to be presented with a map that will allow you to click on a state to deep dive into state-specific requirements. Those will also be included with the federal requirements, so they'll be available in a single location. As you can see, we've developed it for Colorado, California, Washington, Alaska, Vermont, and New York as our initial states, and then you can see this huge swath of states throughout the middle of the country along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers that we have developed specifically with non-power dam development in mind. Within each of these, you can click on the state. It'll provide an overview of the types of threshold questions you should be answering to understand what permits and approvals are going to apply to your project. I'd also mention that because hydropower is a very federal-centric process administered through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and their licensing process, even all these states in gold, you could enter those and it will provide you the federal regulations for hydropower development. So you can see in this key here that gold is the federal available, state and federal is available in the green states, and then state and federal specific to Army Corps non-power dams in the blue states. When someone enters a page within the Rapid Toolkit, they're presented with a number of options. They have flowcharts that they can click on to provide a bird's eye view, and particularly this is helpful with some of the overview pages where it's really just identifying the types of permits and thresholds that may be required. As you enter within each of those, you can see in this little pull-out box here, it will provide a brief overview of what that permit or approval is and when it might be required, and then you can click on it and go through a step-by-step from pre-application meetings to any sort of appeals process of obtaining that permit or approval. One thing I'd like to mention here is that as part of the toolkit, we did create a project management dashboard that's called My Projects. Within each of these, you can, if you have a OpenAI account created and are logged in, you can create a dashboard of your individual projects. And within each approval, there's a little star, and you can click on that star to add it to a project and create multiple projects. So if this is something that people want to use as a light project management tool that would allow them to identify all of the permits applicable to that project, include multiple projects on the dashboard, make some notes associated with that process, and then you can check them off as they're completed. That is a tool that we've included to help support the regulatory and permitting sections of the toolkit itself. Again, we also have our reference library. Our reference library is a sortable database that you can go through, clicking on topics, clicking on what's applicable to either federal or state jurisdictions. And there's also a search tool if you're looking to just use a more common search feature to see if something's included within this reference library. We have found it to be an excellent resource for what exists in kind of the hydropower regulatory space, but also for those who go through and review, specific pages and don't recall where they found that information. This is a nice shortcut to be able to get back to that guidance document or statute or regulation without having to try to repeat your steps of navigating back through the database. And so next, I wanted to speak to our development of these best practice, lesson learned, and regulatory analysis publications. So since the inception of this project, we were really keeping close eye on what issues stakeholders felt warranted more information, more data, more analysis. And throughout identifying those over the first few years of the project, we landed on a series of 7 that we developed. The process for developing these included collecting this input from the stakeholders to identify the best practices initially, reviewing and prioritizing this list with DOE, and then researching and analyzing the issues, which included extensive interviews, dialogue, review with the hydropower industry, which allowed us to get to a point where we felt comfortable publishing these as NREL technical reports. And then once we develop them as technical reports and publish them, we post these to the Rapid Toolkit with a high-level summary and a link to the full reports. The high-level summary generally is kind of a 1 to 3 pager, hitting on some of the key takeaways and bullets within these papers. They might also link to specific pages in the Rapid Toolkit to provide more context on that regulatory process. But then available for download are each of these best practice papers. Generally, they're in the kind of 20 to 50 page range. A couple of them are a little shorter, a couple are a little longer. And again, they speak to a number of issues that were identified that warranted greater attention within the regulatory process. The 7 publications that we have developed to date include a state models to incentivize and streamline small hydropower development. This publication goes through a number of state models to incentivize either financing side, streamline small hydropower development on the permitting side, or other types of examples of programs such as feed-in tariffs and others that might incentivize small hydropower development. We have this regulatory approaches for adding capacity to existing hydropower facilities publication. This really goes through the process of converting a license to an exemption and other strategies for when and how you can add capacity to existing processes, either at the time of relicensing or through capacity or non-capacity amendments to the existing license. We've developed one on energy recovery hydropower, really looking at agricultural water uses, municipal uses, and industrial water uses such as drinking water, wastewater facilities, things like that, and where power in the pipes can be added and what that process looks like for a approval from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We've included one on settlement agreements that walk through the scope of settlement agreements, what can be included within a settlement agreement or off-license agreement, and provides a number of examples of previous settlement agreements, as well as highlights FERC's policies on settlement agreements. We've developed one on a review of the utilization of the ILP, TLP, and ALP, the 3 licensing processes available, focused on, with the ILP being the default licensing process, what is required to receive approval for a TLP or ALP licensing process, examples of projects that have received those approvals from FERC, as well as projects that did not receive those approvals because they were deemed to not meet the regulatory criteria. We have one that we developed for the Bureau of Reclamation, specifically looking at their lease of power privilege program, along with the case studies and considerations associated with that. So we looked at the implementation and utilization of the lease of power privilege, how that kind of broke out geographically by project size, highlighting some specific case studies within where we worked with both reclamation as well as those project developers to vet and verify the information included. And then finally, we have this basin-wide approaches to hydropower relicensing best practice paper. This was the last and most recent one we've published in this space. This walks through a number of case studies across the country, including California, Wisconsin, and New York, focused on various approaches and considerations to trying to analyze hydropower relicensing on a basin scale, looking at what are the advantages and challenges associated with that. As you can see, to date, we've had over 7,500 unique downloads of these best practice papers. As we go further back in time, we generally see higher download numbers for the ones that have been available the longest, a little lighter on the download side for the ones that are more recently available. However, all of these seem to be getting pretty good traction. They all have at least 700 downloads to date. We've seen our original best practice paper with already over 2,000 unique downloads. So we do feel like these are being pretty well utilized by the hydropower community. And then finally, I just want to walk through some high-level metrics here, and then we can take a stop to see if there's any questions. This walks through both the Hydropower Rapid Toolkit as well as the Rapid Toolkit as a whole, which includes the 3 other technologies I briefly mentioned earlier. As you can see, in the 2020 calendar year, we had roughly around 2,600 users that we could specify are hydropower users. And so some of this gets tricky when it comes into processes that apply across technologies, such as, say, Fish and Wildlife Section 7 consultation. People may come to the website to view that for multiple purposes, and so that's hard to capture within an individual technology. However, we could identify 2,600 users that came, we know, specifically for hydropower. 62,000 users plus came to the website as a whole. These users accounted for 3,400 hydropower sessions and over almost 80,000 sessions overall. Again, getting into some of the page views and where we struggle to identify in certain cases if somebody's coming to the website specifically for hydropower or for that process for another infrastructure type. But we can demonstrate that we had 7,800 hydropower specific views. However, that number could be as high as over 60,000 based off of the number of processes that are shared across the technologies. Overall on the website, we saw over 135,000 views. And then lifetime use statistics. At this point, since launch of the Hydropower Rapid Toolkit, we've seen over 10,000 unique users come for hydropower specific information, over 200,000 users come to the toolkit overall. We're approaching about 500,000 views on the website, and the hydropower views continue to climb. Again, the trickiness of identifying specific processes that apply to multiple technologies, but we have a potential max reach of over 200,000 page views applicable to hydropower. In terms of pages that are only applicable to hydropower, we could identify those in the 27,000 range or so. So at this point, I'll take any questions if we have them over the toolkit itself or the use of the toolkit and how we track this information. So do we have any questions, Maxine or Megan?
I haven't seen any come through yet. Just a reminder, folks, that you are welcome to ask questions as the webinar is ongoing. Just pop them in the chat, address them to everyone, and in moments like this, we'll address them. But I think at the moment, Aaron, you are clear to move on.
Great. So I guess with no other questions, I'll just add a couple other details here and then pass it over to my colleague, Taylor Curtis, to walk through our maintenance and our policy tracking updates. So we do pull this information from Google Analytics, and we track it on a regular basis. We were at one point able to track IP addresses very closely and identify the types of users that were coming from federal agencies, state agencies, universities, large consulting and law firms. Unfortunately, some of that ability has been taken away due to privacy concerns, and Google Analytics doesn't allow as transparent of IP address identification as it once did. Fortunately, we did have 6 or 7 years of able to track this and really understand our user base from that position. And that's a question we've gotten commonly, is who's using the website, not just how many are using it. And so from that standpoint, we really have honed in on, I think, congressional staff, federal agencies, academic research, and then a lot of environmental and regulatory consulting firms tend to be the bulk of our users on the website, with law firms, state agencies, and others having pretty substantial representation as well. So if there's no other questions or no questions here, with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Taylor Curtis, my colleague here at NREL, to walk through our process for updating the toolkit and what we're currently tracking.
Thanks, Aaron. Get that passed over to me here. Excellent. Thanks so much, and thanks everybody for joining today. I want to start out by kind of introducing myself and my role in relation to the hydropower toolkit. Like Aaron, I'm an attorney by trade and a legal and policy analyst at NREL, and I've been working on the hydropower rapid from its founding back in 2015, and I lead the toolkit analysis and annual review updates for both the toolkit's hydropower as well as transmission regulatory content. And today I'm going to be discussing with you about our annual maintenance and updates process, and go through some of the kind of federal and state policies that we've been tracking that we've identified that may impact some of the hydropower content. And I am going to turn off my video right now because I'm getting a low connectivity, so hopefully that'll keep me keep my video going. So turn that off right now. Okay. All right. So to start off, each year, our legal team, which is made up of a full-time legal analyst and usually about 2 to 5 legal interns, we review all the hydropower content, regulatory content on RAPID for accuracy, kind of substantive changes to the law by tracking relevant regulations, statutes, and new legislation for both our federal and state content. And anytime we've made a substantive change to the hydropower content, we update and the date to reflect the current year. There's a timestamp on some of those more substantive pages. We also spend a lot of time checking legal citations and references to kind of ensure that those resources are accurate and current. And we also have a script that we run that identifies broken links, and we look at each one of those links and update them accordingly. And oftentimes these links are broken because an agency or organization has restructured their website, and we just need to update the URL. And in other instances, it might be an indication that there might be a substantive change. So we go and we look into that broken link and see if there's a substantive change that we also need to make. In addition to this internal effort to kind of optimize, we look to the content for readability and organization, and work on search engine optimization to make it easier for users to find content more efficiently. And we also use efforts like this and this workshop that we're having today, as well as a feedback widget on the website itself to get user feedback in an effort to kind of improve the toolkit content and capabilities as well as efficiencies. And so there'll be a point at the end of my presentation where we'll be asking during the Q&A section of the webinar to get feedback from all of you on how we can best meet your needs, and if you have any ideas for improvements or changes that you would like to see, we're definitely all open ears. So a big part of our annual review is to track federal and state policy and kind of legislative changes that may impact content on the Rapid Toolkit. And we have a pretty systematic process that kind of enables us to stay on top of changes to policy that may impact this, hydropower development and operations and permitting processes. And over the years, we've figured out a way to kind of streamline this because it's a pretty big effort to track all of this and find the changes that need to be made on these pages. And with that, I'm going to talk about some of the major ones that we're tracking right now. So in January of 2021, the Biden administration signed an executive order 13990, kind of directing federal agencies to review the rules issued in the prior 4 years, and for them to look at those rules that they had adopted in the last 4 years and see if they were inconsistent with the policy stated in this executive order. And so we've seen quite a few movements here. One was starting with the waters of the U.S. We've been tracking the waters of the U.S. kind of legal and political battle for a long time now, and I'm sure we'll continue to do so, and we will continue to do so. And the most recent update is that the EPA and the Department of Army just earlier this month announced their intent to initiate a new rulemaking that restores the protections in place prior to the 2015 WOTUS, or Waters of the United States, implementation, and it develops a new rule to establish a definition of the waters of the U.S. Under the Trump administration, the EPA and the Department of Army had published a navigable waters protection rule in April 2020, and under the Trump administration rule, there are 4 categories of waters that were federally regulated. Territorial seas, traditional navigable waters, perennial and intermittent tributaries to those waters, and also certain like lakes and ponds and impoundments and wetlands. And that final 2020 rule also details about 12 categories of exclusions, features that are not waters of the U.S. And this new announcement for an intent to revise is looking at those exclusions specifically. In addition, in terms of water quality, the EPA has also announced their intent to reconsider and revise the 2020 Clean Water Section Certification Final Rule. That final rule in 2020 did a lot of things. I'll highlight a few of them. It reaffirmed that an action on certification requests must be taken in a reasonable period of time, but in no case later than a year after receipt. It also reaffirmed that certification is required for federal licensed and or permitting activities that may result in a discharge at a point source into the waters of the U.S. It also clarifies the scope of certifying authorities, Clean Water Act Section 401 certification review, and action is limited to assuring that the discharge is from a point source of waters of the U.S. That rule also reaffirms the agency's responsibility to provide technical assistance to any party involved in a 401 water quality certification process. And it also kind of promoted earlier engagement and coordination among project proponents. And EPA's notice of intent that came out earlier this month, it is looking to revise that 2020 final rule, and there's accepting public comment until August of this year. And they have completed their review, and in that notice have identified certain things that they're asking for comment on, which will definitely impact some of the pages and once we see what that final rule is. And some of those things that they called out in the new rulemaking effort were concerns about the 2020 rule in terms of cooperative federalism principles, concerns about states and tribes' rights underneath the new rule. They also called out concerns with whether the 2020 rule improved or impeded the certification and licensing processes, kind of specifically whether projects proponents, there's a new part of the 2020 rule that says that project proponents need to do a pre-filing meeting request before certifying, 30 days before submitting a certification request. That's something that they're calling out as wanting public comment on, and whether or not that is an efficiency gain or an impediment. Some of the other things that they called out were concerns with the new definition of certification request, as well as what qualifies as a reasonable period of time. And so these are things that we will be tracking to see how those will impact, may impact the content that we have on RAPID. And so some of the other things that we're tracking are also in response to the executive order I mentioned, which directed all federal agencies to review and address agency actions during the last 4 years. And so NOAA and Fish and Wildlife Service announced earlier this month that they have an intent to revise, rescind, and restate 5 Trump-era Endangered Species Act regulations, specifically to kind of rescind regulations that revised Fish and Wildlife Service's process for considering exclusions from critical habitat designations, as well as to rescind the regulatory definition of habitat that was developed underneath the 2020 rule, in addition to revising regulations for listing species and designating critical habitat. And they also have called out reinstatement of protections for species listed as threatened under the ESA. And continuing with the trend here, the Fish and Wildlife Service have also published a final rule that is looking to revoke the rule that was passed underneath the Trump administration, which that narrowly interpreted the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to only prohibit intentional take of protected bird species without a permit. So meaning that you had to prove intentional, unintentional, or excuse me, had unintentional take was not, did not require a permit under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which that rule was fiercely litigated. The MBTA has long been a strict liability statute. And there's a district court decision in August of 2020 that rejected the interpretation. In the court, I'm going to actually pull up the language from the court because I thought this was pretty good. It says, they said the plain language of the MTBA's prohibition on killing protected migratory bird species at any time by any means and in any manner shows that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act prohibits incidental kill. So now, kind of based on that district court decision and the Biden administration and the Fish and Wildlife Services revoking that rule, and the new rule kind of implementing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act as prohibiting incidental take and implying enforcement discretion, which it has always. Let's see. And then in terms of, oops. And in terms of the National Environmental Policy Act, there were some recent CEQ, Council of Environmental Quality, final rule decisions that were made here recently and just in the last month as well, to essentially extend the deadline by 2 years for agencies to develop and revise proposed procedures for implementing the Trump administration final July 2020 rule. And that executive order 13990 revoked the executive order 13807, or better known as the One Federal Decision, which looked to streamline the environmental review process under NEPA and impose a 2-year limit on infrastructure project reviews. And some of those changes that the 2020 rule did, they made some revisions to reflect the procedural nature of the statute. They also made some regulatory definition changes to a number of different definitions, including effects and affecting and human environment, and also added new definitions for reasonably foreseeable and reasonable alternatives, and eliminated the definition of cumulative impacts. And going with the trend that we've been talking about today, this new rule, interim rule, is extending the deadline right now and they're reviewing, the CQ is reviewing the 2020 rule for consistency with the national priorities laid out in the Biden administration's executive order. So in addition to our federal content, we also have been tracking policy updates for our state content, or state-specific content, and some of the ones that we've identified that we haven't yet implemented, but that we are working to implement. Changes to the Rapid Toolkit will include changes to the Vermont Certificate of Public Good process in terms of the net metering thresholds, and there is a provision there including small hydropower projects net metered, and how that impacts the Certificate of Public Good. We're also identified that there is a rulemaking with the Department of Environmental Conservation, I think and that they're conducting, their 3-year mandated review of their water quality standards, and we've got some indication that those are going to impact our 401 water quality certification page. And we also say that we call out here Oregon, although we don't have Oregon specific content on the website, we are tracking information about what's going on in Oregon with regards to water rights, and new rule for conversion of a hydroelectric water right to an in-stream water right for the purposes of dam removal. I want to bring that to your attention today. And I think that's my last slide. Yeah. So yeah, I guess we'll open it back up for questions. I know that was a lot of policy jargon.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Taylor. For anyone who would like to ask any questions relevant to the Rapid Toolkit as a whole, or specifically to any of these substantive policy updates that we're tracking, now is a good time. Also listed on the screen here is the contact information for Taylor and myself. And so if there's others that would prefer to ask questions offline through reaching out via email or phone, that's also certainly acceptable. We understand reaching out to us. One thing I'll add is, we're tracking these policy updates, particularly on the rulemaking side, but as I think a lot of you are probably aware, this is a slow-moving process. And so particularly with any sort of new rulemakings that need to go out for notice and comment, and then have the agency review those and comments and respond to them before issuing a final rule. Some of these efforts will likely continue into calendar year 2022 before any new rules in a few of these spaces that we addressed are actually finalized and implemented into the Rapid Toolkit. We generally will, continue to check in on these, and we do receive notifications when the Federal Register posts are issued, and those will always provide timing of when the rule takes effect. We generally don't include the information on the toolkit for public consumption until that rule has taken effect. Usually there's kind of a 60-day window or something like that after final publication before that occurs. So it's not something that you'd see, say, a week after the final rule is issued. It's usually kind of a month or two lag time, depending on the structure of that rule notice itself. Before we would be able to begin adding that to the toolkit, we try to then develop the drafts of that page and be ready for that initiation date of when it actually goes into effect. But that's something to be on the lookout for, that you wouldn't see a process page on the Rapid Toolkit reflecting a new rule, say the day it comes out in the Federal Register. So it seems like we have a very lively group today with lots of questions. So I guess we can give a couple more minutes if anybody does have any questions for us. Oh, it looks like we might have one coming in.
Great. Yeah, the question is from Susan. How does the content in the Rapid Reference Library compare or contrast to the FERC eLibrary? So can you speak to if there's overlap, or do they contain separate documents?
It's a great question. So I'd say generally what's in the Rapid Toolkit in terms of our process pages and descriptions more mirrors the type of information you'd find on FERC's hydropower website with their guidance documents and both from their division of compliance as well as their licensing division. What tends to be in the eLibrary, which is more of your docket information for individual licensing proceedings, that information, if it's included in Rapid, likely is found within a best practice page. But generally, the type of information included in the eLibrary specific to an individual licensing docket is very distinct from what's in the Rapid Reference Library, which would be more of the guidance documents and other information you're likely to find on FERC's hydropower website as opposed to within the eLibrary. I'd say the one exception might be, the eLibrary does include FERC policy statements, and some of that might come into play within the Rapid Toolkit. But generally, I'd say that this is more about the process and when it applies, as opposed to the type of docket proceedings that are actually walking through that individual license proceeding. Taylor, anything to add there?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that you said, Aaron, and then would also say that it's more of the process of the permitting. So you're going to get like pin sites to the statute or regulation or the policy document that we're utilizing to explain that step-by-step permitting process. In addition to that, I'd say, like Aaron, I think you mentioned this already, but in terms of some of the FERC policy documents, those you would mostly see in our best practices. And I will say that when we were developing the toolkit and working on its efficiencies and usability, we used other platforms, and I think that ours is a little easier to find some stuff in for the way ours is organized as well.
Yeah, and something I will add is that we have we do monitor FERC's hydropower licensing and their DAC website, the Division of Compliance website, to see where they have added new, guidance documents, information that could be helpful, and we try to integrate that into the Rapid Toolkit where appropriate. And we did recently review this. FERC has updated their hydropower website. They've included a new GIS mapping tool that has the location of licensed and exempt projects, the docket number, things like that. And so when those things are added, we do try to include them in the reference library and link to them within our pages to provide that supplementary data and information. And so those two websites fairly track fairly well with what we have on the Rapid Toolkit. And we always will just link to those sources as opposed to trying to host them ourselves. So when FERC makes those updates and changes, we also have those changes updated on the website.
Cool. Thanks, y'all. We had a question come in reference to the new NEPA guidance and the 2-year extension. What NEPA guidance are we currently working under for things such as cumulative effects?
That's a great question. Right now, I mean, it's the Trump administration rule. But again, they're working to review this right now, and likely we'll see changes soon.
Yeah, and I'd say the nuance to that tends to be that for projects that had substantially completed their NEPA review prior to that initiation of the Trump rule, they were still operating under that old rule. And so we do have some recent examples across the federal system of EAs and EISs coming out still under that pre-Trump rule, just because of the timeline being, 1 to 3, 4 years sometimes to develop an EIS. However, yeah, I think at the current stage, this Trump rule is in effect. And so if you were beginning a NEPA review, the Trump definitions would apply.
Yes.
I think in large part, the reason why FERC or why some agencies were hesitant to release implementing regulations and why this new CEQ interim final rule extends that deadline is to allow them to reconsider through rulemaking and through potential legal challenges some of the Trump administration's more controversial elements that have caused legal concern within that final CEQ NEPA rule. And I think by prolonging when individual agencies have to update implementing rules, hopefully it allows a lot of that to be worked out in the meantime. But I think it does create this area of uncertainty in terms of the type of impacts that should be included in these NEPA reviews and whether a court is going to hold that they complied with the law if they don't include some of those elements. Typically, most NEPA challenges tend to be on what you didn't analyze or not complying with a procedure within the Administrative Procedure Act. And so if we come to a situation where certain impacts aren't analyzed, trying to use the new rule as justification for that, it'll be interesting to see where courts fall and if they lean more on existing case law on that or on the Trump rule. But I think a lot of that is up in the air and to be determined. And we'll see where agencies fall in terms of erring on the side of caution and including more of this information within NEPA documents to prevent them from having to go back and redo it if a court would hold that it is insufficient in terms of alternatives analysis or impact analysis.
All right. So then this one is kind of, I think, looking at just taking a broader look. Do you see in-stream or hydrokinetic resources as becoming more common and supported, or will the primary focus remain with more traditional hydroelectric generation configurations?
So this is just going to be my personal 2 cents on the issue. I do work with a lot of my colleagues, both at the national labs and DOE. I think from our previous analysis and looking at kind of the way things are moving, I do think that run-of-river type projects, hydrokinetic riverine projects are likely to become more common. I think there's a lot of concerns with damming of rivers and large reservoir storage. A number of issues associated with that, including arid conditions in the West, species impacts, water quality impacts due to sediment buildup and things like that. So, I think the trend is moving in that direction. I'd say the exception tends to be with non-powered dams. I think if there's a dam that exists, Army Corps of Engineer dam that exists for other purposes, flood control, irrigation, recreation, those type of dams seem to be the more low-hanging fruit for conventional hydropower development and retrofitting them with turbines, whereas I think for new project development, new stream reach, I think we see very little proposals out there looking to build new large conventional dams. I think the one exception to that might be pump storage. We have seen an uptick in the number of pump storage licensing dockets the last handful of years as we try to integrate a increasing penetration of renewables, particularly wind and solar, into the grid. And we haven't seen a lot of traction on those projects actually getting constructed yet. But in terms of licensing proceedings and working through the process, we have seen a number of examples of those occur, likely at a higher level than what we've seen for, say, traditional dams. There's still some low-head dams proposals and some other innovative concepts that can incorporate some sort of restoration of the environmental conditions along with hydropower. But I would say the trend tends to be either run-of-river or non-powered dams due to the lower levels of environmental impacts and limited stakeholder concerns in comparison. The other, I think, example that is kind of included in that category is conduit development, which kind of falls somewhere maybe in between when you're talking about its existing infrastructure, that it's being utilized for other purposes. It might be more of a run-of-river type application. It could also be, some sort of low-head dam application or things like that. But really, I think those type of existing infrastructure add-ons seem to be where we're seeing that type of development occur, as opposed to any sort of new damming of river reaches. In reality, it seems to be the opposite, more on the decommissioning side.
Removal.
We're seeing, that, and we're seeing removal of dams, or at least incentives to remove dams as opposed to build new traditional dams.
Yeah, and all I'll add is if you follow the dollars, there's a lot of dollars being sent to research and development for the hydrokinetics. So that seems to be what we'll be seeing in the future.
Oh, I love looking to the future. Any other questions from the audience while we have our wonderful team here? If not, as they mentioned, their contacts were on the screen. They were also dropped in the chat. They also have their newsletter to stay in touch, to stay on top of all the new updates and the different developments. And we definitely encourage you to take a gander. And unless there are any final questions, any final thoughts from you, Aaron and Taylor?
So I think the only thing I'd add here specifically to this slide is that you can sign up for this newsletter. It's on the hydropower page within the Rapid Toolkit. So if you go to rapidtoolkit.org and either click the hydropower icon or just the hydropower tab at the top of the screen, on that page is where you can sign up for this newsletter. As Maxine said, this is where we include updates on the Rapid Toolkit. We also generally, it's how we announce these webinars, or we're going to be in person speaking at an event. From time to time, we also might utilize it to release relevant publications from DOE or NREL on hydropower regulation. So it is a good source to keep up to date without having to go to the website constantly.
Yeah.
And
Taylor,
Megan included that URL in the chat for those of you who would like to sign up and haven't already.
No, just to also encourage everybody that was here today, if you have things that you would like to see, or if there's some type of policy that we did not talk about today that you think may impact some of our content, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have our contact information we provided. We also have a contact us tab on the website, as well as a little feedback widget on any individual page that you can click on where it says feedback, and it'll send us feedback directly on that page if you do identify any content that you think would be relevant that should be added or updated. We certainly appreciate our stakeholder community flagging those items for us.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We get to be in the lovely position of giving you some time back in your day. And have a wonderful rest of your day. Hope to see you next time.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.